So thanks, Liz, for joining us at the Pumphouse to talk about this incredible group exhibition. I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit about the title, What Do I Need to Do to Make It Okay?
It's a direct quotation from Dorothy Caldwell, who's one of the artists in the show. And Dorothy's the most senior artist. She's had her practice established for more than 40 years. She studied at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, and shortly thereafter, in the early 70s, relocated to a rural part of Ontario in Canada, and she's lived there ever since with her partner. Very early on in her practice, she started moving towards textiles, started getting a bit of a name for being interested in architecture and in sort of the man-made environment, and got the call for a big commission, was shortlisted to go to a place somewhere in the Midwest of Canada with a couple of other artists to make some massive textile installation for this brand new art building. And she felt very junior, very scared about it all, and really thought that she was not going to get picked for it, and was amazed when she did. And the thing that happened to her was that she looked at this huge space of wall and thought, oh my God, what can I do to make this okay? And it was very much a feeling of panic. But interestingly enough, what happened was that she stayed in the town for a few days. She cancelled her flight back home, borrowed a bicycle from someone, and cycled around the town and got to kind of absorb the landscape, and then worked with a local quilting group to come up with this massive wall hanging. It's one of the biggest things she's ever done, and it's fantastic, and it's still there. It's been there for something like 30, 35 years. But I just love the way that Dorothy's initial reaction wasn't, yeah, I can do it. She said she was surrounded by all these senior artists who were kind of very, yeah, fine, this is good, this is fine. But she was actually the one who got the job. And I think sometimes it's that feeling of how can we manage things? How can we make it okay? It's not always about making things better, and that's really a key to a lot of the work in the show.
Particularly the work behind you by Celia Pym, we see these incredibly bright sports socks that have been so kind of intricately and lovingly darned with these vibrant colours. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that process of the manifestation of anxieties and fears in the kind of everyday life, whether that be domestically or socially, and the kind of activities or the activity of stitching, and in this case kind of darning as a vehicle for that kind of anxiety.
It's an interesting one, because I think for a lot of people traditionally that idea of the repetitive stitch or some other textile practice, for example weaving, which I used to do, there is something that's kind of, weaving is like a mantra. It's something you repeat over and over, and it gives you thinking space. And when I wove, I used to use my weaving time to think about the next thing I was going to make, because once you've got it on the loom, you're kind of pretty restricted. With darning, it's a bit of a different thing. You can go in a lot of different directions, and Celia Pym has really embraced the darn as a kind of a means of expression for her. So sometimes it's about a repetitive activity, and there's another piece of hers in the show called I Think I Will, which is about cross stitch, where she's very much saying, okay, am I going to do this? Yes, I think I will. I'm going to commit myself to this process, and I don't know where it's going to end up. With this actually came out of a residency that Celia did at King's College London, which is part of a Crafts Council project called Parallel Practices, and it's got quite a kind of a, not exactly a dark background, but an unusual background, not one that you'd associate with socks.
And picking up on that point about kind of the navigating the journey or the quest of making, whether it be a quilt or kind of embroidery or tapestry or weaving or knitting, I wondered if there was some kind of parallel in that kind of internal landscape of the journey and the sort of quest or the unspoken narrative that happens when we're thinking as we're doing, and how that is then made visible in the works themselves.
I think journey is a really good word, actually. When I was thinking about the challenges of presenting this show, it's a touring exhibition, so it's starting here at the Pumphouse Gallery, which is a lovely building, but it's over 4 floors and every room has its own character, so you have to think quite hard about how the work will go. And I realised that the first room where people come in, the first thing they see is some work by Dorothy Caldwell and also a piece by Freddie Robbins, and that they are almost explicit references to journeys. In Dorothy's case, she's referencing her own work. She's done a lot of residencies and explorations, physical explorations, where she's travelled through landscapes that have been shaped by mankind for hundreds of years, thousands of years in some cases. So she's worked with Inuit communities in Baffin Island, up in the Arctic Circle area of Canada. She's also worked in South Australia on a couple of residencies there, where she's travelled through some of the very old lands where Native Australian people have left marks on the land, on rock walls and places like that to help them to navigate through. So when Dorothy goes away, she uses those times of research she's understanding as much about how the people live as about how she might then transfer it into art. And the works that she creates afterwards are very much her own landscape. So they don't explicitly reference anything that you're going to see on a map from either of those places or in fact anywhere else she's been. She's travelled very extensively. But they are about her trying to make sense of what she's been told about the sense of peace, isolation, fear, intrigue, all the different things she experiences when she goes to those different places. With Freddie Robbins, it's rather a different thing in that Freddie tends to be very much focused on the internal journeys. She's done a lot of work that's around feelings of sadness, of misery, even of death, of murder. She did a fantastic series called The Knitted Houses of Crime some years ago, which I think a lot of people are familiar with her work would remember as a real highlight. And the work she's got in this show, one piece is very explicitly just about feeling miserable, and the other piece is actually, it's about using discarded objects, but somehow it's turning into something that's also a meditation on the guillotine and the French Revolution, which maybe seems a little bit odd, and it's definitely not about repair, but there's a lot of damage in there. And it's Freddie's way of trying to reconcile herself to that kind of sense of emotional damage that she feels that is so persistent in the world. So making it okay is not necessarily about making it better. It's not about repair always, although repair may be part of it, repair techniques may be part of it. But sometimes it's understanding that process of change that we've gone through or that our landscape's gone through, the objects around us, and finding that way of reconciling and maybe making some sense of it. So, for example, the work of Celia's, the sock work, has come out of a residency she did in the dissecting room, which is where the medical students learn about anatomy. So in the process that's going on there, it's a learning process, but it's something that ultimately the people who very kindly donate their bodies know that their bodies are going to be kind of fairly substantially taken apart. You literally can't put them back together again.
I wondered whether when we're looking at the more kind of technological based works and the processes that are employed there being slightly more removed from the hand of the artist, whether there was any kind of difference in the quality of time that's invested in this?
I think there can still be a lot of time invested. If we look at the computerised embroidery that Karina Thompson uses, her biggest piece to date was made specifically for Salts Mills and Saltaire, just outside Bradford, which was a former textile mill, now an art centre. And she made a piece that's 100 metres long, which references her running through the space. She actually literally ran through the space. This is for a project a couple of years ago, and was wired up, and they did scans of her heart, and she translated it into a piece of embroidery, which is 100 metres long. She talks about the intensity of working through that. So the actual running was obviously something that happened quite quickly. It was all over in a few minutes, but the embroidery took her months and months and months to make. Translating those files that she had from the medical machinery, turning it into something that would actually read well as embroidery on cloth, plotting it out, working out the spacing and everything, and then the actual physical act of embroidery. She took over the family dining room because her studio wasn't big enough and she needed a big table to work on, and said that she felt that she'd almost temporarily gone insane over the period of time that it took her to do it because of the intensity of concentration. So just in the same way that there's a lot of handwork and a lot of time in the socks here with Karina, there's also an intensity of making. With Freddie Robbins, with her knitted pieces, it's a slightly different thing in that a lot of her work has been produced in a very high-tech way. She's worked with a facility at the University in Manchester to produce a lot of it. But she often is struggling with how to resolve pieces. So, for example, the basket case piece on the ground floor, the head in the basket, which references the guillotine, that came from a big body of work she made, which was entire knitted bodies. They were human scale. And she was very frustrated that although she had this incredibly high-tech machine to make something that was a human scale, fully knitted, three-dimensional body that could be sort of stuffed or hung or laid on the floor or whatever, that sometimes they went wrong. And Freddie, there's a great quote from her in a recent talk she gave where she talks about how she really loves the imperfect in other people, but she can't tolerate it in herself. And so for her, one of the problems was that although she had this kind of body of bodies, some of them had been snagged on the knitting machine or the yarn had broken or whatever, so there were holes in them, they weren't perfect. she couldn't bear to throw them away because of the intense time she and the technician spent, because of the volume of yarn that had gone into them. But they've been sitting around in her studio, and there's one piece in the show on the first floor, I'm So Bloody Sad, which is the piece about misery. And that's taken her about 8 years to make, because she was continually questioning, what am I doing with this? What am I doing with this shape? What am I doing with this yarn? How do I want to finish it? What am I trying to say here? So sometimes it's a period of time that's about the thinking as much as about the making.
The show overall strikes me as being a very kind of conceptual manifestation of these processes, these very kind of physical processes. And I just wondered whether for you in curating the exhibition, there was this sense of kind of conceptual narrative and how we experience each room as we kind of move through the show.
The narrative definitely comes first, and there's certainly some traditional textile technique for people who are interested in that. We have Karina Thompson, who works in what you might call a quilt tradition, and one of her pieces is in fact very much referencing a traditional bed quilt. It's about the size and scale of a bed, and it has a series of motifs which almost but don't quite repeat. They're the same size and shape, but they have differences in the detail. And that piece is called 60 Beats a Minute, and it's actually taken from scans of her own heart. Karina's done quite a lot of work around cardiology. Her partner works in that area in one of the big hospitals in Birmingham, so it's been an area of interest for her because it comes up over the dinner table. So she takes that traditional quilt form and then uses very high technology, really high-end sewing machines, which effectively have kind of like Photoshop embedded in them, to turn this into new work. We've got the tradition also with Saidhbhín Gibson. Her piece Comfort and Joy, which is a discarded thrush's nest, is held together by an internal band of needlepoint lace. And although Saidhbhín works across a lot of different media and forms, that's a piece she and I are both particularly proud of and fond of. It felt like a good piece to bring into the show. Illnesses, diseases, viruses damage us. We cut ourselves, we damage ourselves, and then there's a sense of repair, but we don't always repair in the same way. So, for example, Karina Thompson's new body of work is looking at the impact of leprosy on human skeletons, and she's working with a team from the University of Bradford who have excavated a medieval graveyard where lepers were traditionally buried, and they've been using very high-tech scans of the bodies to try to understand how the disease impacts on the bones and on the body overall. So she's working with the imagery that they're producing to make her work. And then when we come up to the top, to the mezzanine, which is above this area, we have a series of small-scale works which are about the kind of intimacy. And there's an intimacy in the notion of repair, the intimacy of the darn, the way that you have to work very closely on it. The intimacy of repair when a doctor or a nurse is dressing a wound or is, maybe stitching up after an operation, that level of closeness that comes. If we think about it emotionally, sometimes the times that we achieve some kind of reconciliation with our problems is the time when we have some kind of intimate support from a friend or a family, or maybe somebody professionally who's able to kind of come to us on a one-to-one level. So I think intimacy is a really important part of it. And it's not just simply the, I'm standing this far from the artwork, it's that time to reflect and to consider what's there, and to think about how it makes us feel. Hopefully we'll all feel okay. If we feel better, that's a good thing. But I think we have to accept that doesn't always happen.
For me, there's also a humour and a kind of comedy that's in some of the works. And, in particular, you come in downstairs and the first work you see is Basket Case, and it's so full of such complex meaning and resonance, but also one of humour and playfulness. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see the exhibition from a kind of playful perspective.
Yeah, that's really important. Humour always attracts me. I love Freddie's work because it's witty, and even when she's making something quite dark, there's always something that's funny about it, that it can't help raise a smile. I'm So Bloody Sad, and there's the head hanging down, and she's a knitter, and the poor head spiked with knitting needles coming out, and the hands are, it makes me think a bit of Edward Scissorhands, the idea of hands that are physically, they're not going to be able to achieve anything in themselves. They're kind of, their own structure violates their ability to do anything. But it's kind of witty at the same time. It's a commentary on knitting. Black humour, it's a well-established concept. I think we need to have those moments of levity. If the show was all really miserable, then I would feel that I'd failed, because it is about making things okay. one of the things I really love about this, apart from the fact it's just fun to look at, it's got a bit of a kind of a pop art feel about it. It's covered in lots of sports brands, so that's a long, long way from fine art. But the other thing which this is a personal thing, but it does amuse me, is that the Pumphouse Gallery is licensed for weddings, and when people get married here, there are two places they can actually exchange vows, and one of the places is down at the front door, which is in a really beautiful arch, but the other place is right here. So I love the idea of people getting married in front of these socks. It's kind of pleasing. This is something a bit amusing about it all. And I gather there's already been a wedding here, so maybe there is someone out there with a photo of themselves signing the register in front of a whole lot of socks.
And what's the influence of Louise Bourgeois' work been on the exhibition?
Yes, Louise Bourgeois talked about the power of the needle, and I came across this quotation. I think I probably read it before years ago and I'd forgotten about it, and I was just reading around looking at something else, and there it was, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, because I've been struggling a little bit with whether I was going to have this as a textile show or not. My own background is art textiles, and I believe strongly in art textiles as a really fantastic medium for expressing a lot of very complex concepts. But I didn't want to be precious enough to say, no, it's got to be textiles and nothing else. And in my practice over the years, I've often worked with artists across craft and design and fine art practices. So, I'm fairly open to who I work with. But this quotation kind of brought it home for me. And so what Louise Bourgeois said was, when I was growing up, all the women in my house were using needles. I've always had a fascination with the needle, the magic power of the needle. The needle is used to repair damage. It's a claim to forgiveness. It is never aggressive. It's not a pin. I found that really satisfying. I thought, okay, that's it. Yeah, that pulls it together for me.